initial thoughts on this, like the videos and things coming out. I haven't followed all the details of it. Just a lot of different topics in the air, and so I just kind of get just little snippets of various things going on behind the scenes on social media. But this surfacing of people saying that in the religious realm of things on social media, that there's like becoming this sense of different Christian contributors that are debating Islam getting doxxed and stuff like that. Of course, I am not one that wants to advocate for like doxing and stuff like that in terms of people trying to have debates online and having difficult discussions and stuff like that. Generally, I tend to think that when debates do become difficult and there's that tendency to want to kind of weaponize responses and whatnot, you just kind of have to go into a stage of like seeking internally about stuff and kind of waiting on life to help develop the next stages of like interaction and whatnot. Basically, like at those times when someone, like you get into debates and whatnot, and then you go through a stage where maybe it feels like topics become really heated and then people respond in various ways like these. But anyway, first I want to say, I guess before getting into that, what's difficult about this though, because I've followed these conversations for a long time, and Sam Harris was among various ones, like a major debate opponent against Islam and religion in general. And he had even gone through stages where if various groups would get into contention within religion, there would be like some strife back and forth, and they weren't really using the word doxing back then, but just kind of functional social pressures and stuff. I think what's difficult about it is like it comes up as though people start to feel attacked by Islam, right? It starts to be sold as like the system and our way of life is being attacked by Islam. And you just hear that a lot. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen or that it doesn't start to become developed as though people get into these topics and it gets heated and there's these difficult stages of it, and then they end up going into these other measures and whatnot. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm not denying that contention happens. But I think looking at it as helping people to possibly see what they're not seeing. Generally, Christianity is already protected in the system for the most part and is systemically protected. And so a lot of times in the past when other Muslims or like Islamic groups and other religious groups would kind of come to the table and have discussions, it was already slanted. There was already economic pressures, institutional pressures, other things that would function as, how would you say it? Kind of like guarding and protecting Christianity. And I think there's ways by which certain forms of like Judeo-Christianity is just already protected in the system, and there's already a slant against Islam. And I think when people come to the table and they don't even really realize that, already in a sense where Islam and other religious groups and cultural groups that don't fit inside that framework are already kind of functionally doxed. And it could be like, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it is obvious, but sometimes it's like soft doxing, I guess, if you want to say, where the things that people might start to experience as like obvious doxing, the things that it functions as, whether it's like produces societal vulnerability or a sense of targeting or a weaponization or economic pressure, things like that. Of course, they don't like those things. And I'm not saying those things should be weaponized. But as I was saying, these things are already functionally set in motion against other groups already. And And I just don't know that people, when they create these platforms and they network with various groups, they're already building the cards. Like, take for instance, various prominent speakers would join forces, say like in the UK, and they join forces with the US. And they just think this is calm, this is peaceful, this is a signal of crowd capture. Maybe they don't think of it like that. But it really is a social pressure. It's, maybe that's not how they want to see it. They just see it as a panel of different ones, But it's also a panel of power, a panel of perception. And so you also had noticed, so in the past I would notice when like Sam Harris would have his certain ideas and whatnot, he could easily, subliminally or almost obviously, get the crowd to do certain things or behave in certain ways. And it was like not always obvious, but functionally a type of doxing. And I don't think people see it like that. They don't see how, on a systemic level, certain groups already get that type of treatment. And in some ways, that's why some groups, that's probably also why Islam is also associated with a religion that was available and accessible to marginalized groups a lot. They'll even say like some groups found Islam as an alternative to seeking guidance and disciplines in life, like in the prison system and stuff like that, or in marginalized communities or in activist communities, because it would give a voice for those seeking some type of guidance and direction, and it wouldn't be a systemic perpetuation waged against them. And so you kind of wonder if some of these groups that advocate for like systemic pressures and systemic preservation within Western civilization notice and feel threatened, like an undercurrent of feeling their systemic forces threatened by simply having discussions with groups like this that come from these perspectives outside the system. That there aren't more levels of it becoming complicated where when you're not trying to use systemic forces and whatnot. Whereas I think people just don't see, like I was saying, that already functions like that. You can't say anything. If you slip up and get angry, you're going to have the system against you. I've seen that happen with a lot of contributors. Even when they showed that they wanted to have discussions about, like practical ways of improvements and whatnot. If there's any hint of them challenging the system or calling out the system, then they instantly have functional sanctions on their life, functional doxing, a panel of people against them, investors waged against them, investigations against them, slander. And so I'm not saying that this justifies continual continual sense of like animosity and stuff like that. I am trying to help bring voice to, because I feel like bringing voice and validating where people are coming from, or at least not really validating what it becomes, but trying to help explain where some of that frustration and animosity comes from, can be transformative, so that people can recognize that, so that people having these discussions realize there is kind of a slanted sense of like tensions already built into even getting to the point of having these conversations and whatnot. And now even what we're seeing is it's not just, say, the US, but like geopolitically, there are things set up. And now we're seeing that things are coming out where become more and more apparent, or seemingly apparent, that there's a lot of money fixed against various groups and pressures that are set against various ones and investors. And so there really is power struggles embedded in certain types of investments in the way people build institutions and society. And those types of pressures become activated when people try to talk about various ideas. And if people are trying to come to the table to talk about transformative ideas, then it's just seems necessary to recognize those things. Of course, when it gets to the stage where when people don't understand those and they kind of trip over these societal things, and then they just start So like something that can happen is like when you don't recognize these things, you stumble into these conversations and you think it's just trade for trade, the ideas on the page, and you don't realize the systemic forces behind it. It comes across as maybe like a denialism of that history, or just not understanding the context of some things. And then people would in some ways respond as though, okay, you don't see the other factors associated with this, so let's show you what it's like to have the other factors associated with this. And so associated with a lot of religion and belief and other things and cultural practice is systemic animosities and things waged against people. And so it's not just ideas on a page. It's systemic forces. It's degrees of your life being threatened. It's vulnerabilities attached to it. And so when people don't see all of those things, then other people kind of bring it out in other ways. And then it becomes hostile, and then people want to shut down the conversations because they think, well, now this is hostile. Now this is like tied to like systemic, institutional, life-threatening situations. And it's like, well, maybe at some level recognizing it already is those things. And that's why the conversations are even being had. It's also about people. It's also about God. It's also about how systems are built and developed in reference to God and freedom and things like that. I remember years back, and Sam Harris and them even utilized that pressure. They didn't want to come right out because it did seem like a battle of perception of morality. And they didn't seem to want to come out and appear to be violent and appear to be all of these things because their argument against other beliefs was like, they're violent, they're doing this, they're doing that, which at some level, there is that. There does seem to be that does become kind of like brought into the public square in a more obvious sense. But then the question is, where does that come from? And so I do remember seeing Sam Harris and some of his group leverage some of their money and their public platform and their pressure. And they were encouraging people to slander. This is what it seemed like to me. Maybe they would say we weren't encouraging this, but what it came across and resulted as is people in the public making it very uncomfortable for Muslim women to have their hijab and to be covered. They wanted to make it so that they were uncomfortable in the marketplace, in the city square, in the public. They wanted them to feel the pressure of discomfort. They wanted them to go out and make it obvious that they would be destructive and slander the Quran in the streets. They wanted them to make caricatures and intentionally blaspheme the Quran. They wanted Hollywood to get in on it. They wanted women to intentionally parade themselves out in the streets and to make obvious their quote unquote feminine freedoms. And to me, it was just such a, having the experience that I have, like my cultural background and seeing the misuse of religion and societal pressure and all of these mix-ups, it just wasn't the approach I just felt like was inappropriate and was not a claim of being peaceful, even if they were saying it wasn't violent, and it would leave groups to feel like, okay, this functionally makes it difficult for us to work. This functionally makes it difficult for us to be comfortable at school. It makes it functionally difficult to, so the result was basically like the seeming result that the atheist movement, when they were doing this, when they were trying to debate Islam, the result that they seemed to want was eventually you'll absorb into what's comfortable to us, appearance-wise, so that we don't have to feel different cultures in their streets. And then functionally, you'll feel so ashamed that you won't even have any confidence in connection to like discussing or even adhering to the Quran. And prior to, explaining some of, maybe they would say, well, we did that because we felt animosity from them. We couldn't have a conversation about it and we felt But anyway, I'm just saying, like, I'd seen things develop over the years where there was like intentional societal economic pressure, dehumanizing, shaming, of which then was influenced on their women and their children being made intentionally uncomfortable in any public setting. And they wanted them to, like, even stuff that they didn't need to make a big deal. Like when women would be too covered, some Muslim women would choose to be too covered when they would go swimming, or that was their assumption. It was just all this like shame and slander and whatnot, even to the point where groups, there wasn't enough knowledge as to like who was actually Muslim and who wasn't, and so they would get other religious beliefs confused. So it became like an onslaught of anyone that looks different than this certain westernized version of like like modern living, to go after and slander and whatnot. And it just, to me, was like a fuel for an improper, hostile society. Just kind of saying a little bit of the background, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's not trying to justify when things become contentious and doxing and all of that kind of stuff, but I have seen some of these conversations develop into where they're being weaponized, and you could tell it's kind of becoming a power struggle, and there's not really an understanding. And I do think there's a little tinge of, what we're seeing now. There isn't really the intention. I mean, I don't know. I had thought, when I was following some of it, I had thought there seems to be a little bit of intention to find some cohesiveness, but there's a little bit of like what I see as like a religiosity where there's too much jockeying for competing for like the outcome of the idea of God, as opposed to understanding, like seeing God within these situations and whatnot. And it's just not really the way that I would approach, or probably approach the idea or the topic of Islam and whatnot. For one, I'd recognize the systemic forces that are even geopolitically connected. This really does connect with the way that even the U.S. connects with Israel, and Israel has pressures on certain Islamic countries, and then the way that has ripple effects across the world, and people seem to imagine it's associated with this battle over Western civilization and stuff like that. Like, you see that connection going on. You see the like sanctions and pressures put on various ones, and you see various ones being used for societal pressure of like, do you want like this is the battle for the free world, and how it's just placed like that, which goes along with a lot of false perceptions on what freedom really is and what the practices of freedom and spiritual freedom through God really is, and the abilities from there to actually work through relationships to understand various ones. And there's just a lot that goes into it. On another note, on a simple note, like the idea of Islam, there's just a lot of ignorance too, I think. Like on a very simple note, if someone said, well, how do you even begin to start this conversation? And right now I'm not ready to unpack all of that. It's a longer conversation, a lot of relationship building there. But in a general sense, I would basically kind of propose that really challenging and recognizing that Islam is not trying to, in its spiritual practice, is not trying to solve the same thing that Christianity was solving or resolving in terms of the stage of revelation. It's not producing the same stage of spiritual revelation, just like Christianity is not doing the same thing that Judaism was doing. There's similarities in seeing the expression, the cohesiveness of God, but Judaism was setting a certain foundation. Christianity was fulfilling it and helping it to be understood, to give that capacity for people to recognize God working within their lives and have that lived expression. And Islam is a result of some of the calling of the Abrahamic calling to recognize the ability for that continual spiritual practice visiting upon within different cultural unique experiences, drawing them into that connection with God within their cultural expressions, and then seeing the ability through these various practices to understand both the universal aspect of God, but then how it kind of like forms together. That's like a simple way of putting it. But, when you think about what was happening with Muhammad, it was deemed a spiritual experience. I get it. There's this issue within the westernized system's form of interpreting this competitiveness of religion. And there's just such a difficulty, it seems like, for some forms of that approach. There just needs to be a breakthrough on that whole approach of looking at spirituality and religion as this like competition of just seeing God as in one place and not in another place. Even God, I don't know if I should go into this, but just because this is a whole other conversation, there's a breakthrough that needs to happen in terms of religion imagining. So with this, religion coincided with the expansion and world market and dominion, which has this type of interpretation where it doesn't really look at connecting the revelation of God to other like spiritual expressions and then seeing those revealed in a mutuality. In some smaller forms it does, where people in their individual practice can have that conviction to work on relationship and whatnot. But in general, some of the expansion of the idea of God within the system and the mode of the dominant system generally had this idea that it was bringing God to people, not that people had expressions of God, which isn't even biblical, because the network of life has within it the component in the Spirit of God. What we're looking at is this ability to connect God and refine it in this type of like system, which reveals these spiritual expressions and mutuality. To put it simply, a lot of religiosity doesn't see it that way. They see it as there's God here and not there. And so they think they have to entirely change some like the places that they go and whatnot. They think it has to be 100% assimilation, which is incorrect. And I think some of that is influenced from the way they interpret a lot of the conquering of land narratives, which I think are also incorrect in this scripture. I think there's ways to be in alignment with scripture, but to interpret those differently, as to also put it simply, as an expression of the thing that the scriptures are trying to remedy, to portray the tendencies of a wounded system to do things like that. And so it's actually more of a story of to not do that, to have a revelation eventually that we see the ability to stop perpetuating those types of division and see the spiritual mutuality in people, and then create a place for it to build in a network together. And so that, the building of relationship, the transformative methods and things like that. And so when you're looking through some of the scriptures, then you're finding that there's this actually some of the better version, or like the massive reveal that we get from the state of Jesus, should be, at least a component of it, an aspect or attribute of it, should be the freedom, the spiritual freedom to be able to produce that mutuality, seek for that mutuality, seek for the life and the spiritual connection with other human beings. And if people had seen that and recognized the freedom to do that, we would be living in a totally different world. It wouldn't still be this sense of conquering lands and, like a one-sidedness of power and dominion that seems more situated with the world powers than it does the Spirit of God. There would have been the ability to say, hey, that spiritual expression you have fits with this form of this network of this spiritual movement and this connection that's happening. But we don't see that. We don't always see that. And so we're still, I think, working through the need to understand that happening. So along those lines, if people were functioning through that sense of mutuality, they would see and be able to see through that spiritual lens that there was a Spirit of God working through a lot of different movements and ways to build connection along those lines. That doesn't mean that every single thing that becomes like the human byproduct of a certain culture or religion will forever be, something that is always like equally relevant, because some of the products of different sections of culture, religion, is a product of like awaiting the relief of a healed network that cultures in themselves can't really be relieved from that. There's societal portions of, certain aspects of religion that develop because of the need to have a breakthrough on a larger sense. So it's out of their control. And so on one sense, when we're building that network, we can alleviate those things. We can alleviate those other portions. So I'm just saying that because I can understand, being in religious debates for a long time, people will say, well, does that mean like everything is the same and that's not what I'm saying. There's certain portions of, like, I tweeted about this before, like a few days ago, trying to give like a basic explanation as when you're looking at culture or religion, at some point there's like the basic core of a belief, and then there's the basic core of an experience, and there's the other stage of learning into the societal shared aspect of it, and then there's like this other grown stage of more of on a system level within your, not like system like overall, but kind of like a societal trade of ideas, which creates some levels of like the trade, the economy, possibly, like the bravado, the show of force, the defense. And that's a totally different stage. So a lot of times I feel like when people are having conflict with debating other religions or cultures, they're always looking at that stage because that's where they interact with other groups and they feel like there's a defensiveness here. There's a show of force here. Because that's the protective layer of like the outer parts of a culture. But when you're actually looking for the spiritual connection, you have to work into relationship and get to those core, like the core principles, the core like basic components of life and relationship. And so as groups do that, they can alleviate that outward network of those portions of defensiveness and things like that, because that is part of the societal network. And so if people really want to alleviate those, then they need to realize that's not really the core of like religion and culture. So just like a lot of religious and cultural beliefs, there can be the expected outer portions that can become like alleviated. So a lot of times when you're looking at the problematic aspects of religion or culture, it almost always has to do with what they have to do on a survival level for money or strategy, or what they do in the area of like cross-cultural trade, which means like the marketplace of their ideas. Almost every problematic portion is from that stage. So that's actually what we have the freedom to alleviate without feeling like we're like undercutting or discrediting the entire cultural, spiritual contribution of the core beliefs. And so for me, when I try to approach these discussions, I imagine some of those things are stuff that through relationship we have to alleviate. You can never really alleviate that with like another power against it, because then that means you're preserving your power, but you're trying to like conquer somebody else's, and you're just going to create it. That's where it's created from. It can only be alleviated for the most part through like relationship and alleviating that approach. And on the world stage, when we debate culture and religion, we never alleviate that approach. It always just shifts around and then creates different slants of power. So you'll see like people will say, well, during this era, this group had this outer power, and then this group had systemic power, or this group had systemic power, and it switches around. And so then you never get to the core of like merging the relational core values. Along those lines, I just kind of say that because the way that I tend to generally approach Islam, I don't really see it as this sense of competing with Christianity or Judaism as much as another stage of the experience of a spiritual experience within a cultural setting, and at the beginning of it having a substance of like various attributes of actually being a spiritual occurrence to improve various conditions that Muhammad and the people were in. And so when you think about that, the notion that Muhammad was having this spiritual experience and was seeking for ways to understand it, and didn't even seem to really want it, and was, kind of discomforted and disturbed about it. And he actually then reached out to, I believe it was his wife at the time, or his wife to reach out to her cousin who was a Christian. And then they ended up mentoring him and helping him work through it. And they kind of concluded that it seemed that he was having this spiritual experience, that he would be called to help introduce some type of spiritual insight within their cultural context. And so there were measures of trying to increase that level of certain types of economic and egalitarian type freedoms within that setting. Later on, when they're just like with a lot of religious practices, as you continue to grow in your freedom, something about spiritual freedom eventually draws attention from those in the power domain that start to see you as a threat. And so as they start to be determined or recognized as a felt threat to the way that things were functioning, then enters into the stage of being detected on and having to strategize for your preservation and protection. And then they had to move around and strategize. And then there were areas of conflict and contention. And then from there, it develops even more, and further out becomes complex, especially when it reaches the stage of interacting with the system and dominion. Just like the difficult developments of any type of religious practice, and then it becomes complicated within interaction with the dominant system's economy or war, conflict, and whatnot. And then the stressors that develop from there in terms of like internal pressures and external pressures, and just a variety of strategies along those lines. So when you think about that and you imagine, it's not that difficult to imagine somebody kind of being stirred in their spirit within their cultural context to work out connections of like spiritual growths and attributes that would have the fruits of spiritual freedoms for people within their society. And so when you think about some of those and how those were some of the outcomes and the freedom sought, and that he was receptive to guidance and connection within like the Jewish and Christian types of spiritual practice, then it just seems inaccurate then these days for people, just because, Islam is growing in relation to continuing to seek for those freedoms, and then it brushes up against the dominant system. Just because there's those tensions along those lines, it doesn't mean that everything about it is inaccurate or that it's ultimately in competition to like other religions. Even in some of the, like in Reza Aslan's book, No God But God, and there's stuff there that I can draw upon, and then, stuff that maybe I disagree with. But he does communicate in there that Islam wasn't looking to become a new religion or some type of like competing religion. It was the continuing in the legacy of spiritual revelation within like the Abrahamic traditions. And so getting to the point today where people look at Islam as a sense of competition for the dominant system's religion, I just think is inaccurate. And it comes from a sense where there's portions within the dominant system that just don't know how to look at connecting. So something that is a difficulty in the dominant system being kind of connected to the way religion is interpreted makes it difficult seemingly for those practices to understand that not everything that has a spiritual connotation or like opportunity for spiritual connection is in competition with the dominant system or like within other religions. That's just kind of a way that the system has shaped the way some of the religions within it seem to interpret things. Another aspect of that, though, is because there's some stuff that needs to kind of be worked out, negotiated within how people interpret religion. And so I understand and recognize that that's like a whole other conversation to have as well. But in terms of just having, like human decency and universal human rights and the ability to give people that room to have other cultural expression is a good place to start. And almost every time throughout history that people don't do that, it always ends up in like even worse conditions and improper fear of, like the other. And then from there, it's kind of self-justifying that you create hostility because people don't work through like the basic measures of like the disciplines of relationship in the public square and stuff like that. And so even though it does get to the point where there can be contention and then people end up using these other methods of pressure, instead of really resolving the spirit of connection within religions, like of course that can happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, and I'm not denying that it doesn't, but I think I'm just looking at it. You find that happen though when people don't try to take these other measures, are opportunities to like create better connection and whatnot. I also do think like people take cheap shots against other religious beliefs and they kind of exacerbate claims where, maybe out of context or there's just a lot of ways by which people, when they get into kind of like a competing for religion and not really seeing like what's the spiritual principle here, because, they're not always talking, when people get into competing about religion, they're kind of talking about the institutionalized versions in the public square of certain religious practices along those lines. But they're not really thinking about actual spiritual practice and the actual core spiritual experiences that are attributed to like how existence in life is and how God manifests through growth of revelation through people and whatnot. There's pros and cons about the institutionalized stage of belief and whatnot. There's a usefulness of it, but then there's also a hindrance because people then don't feel the freedom to like tap into that receptivity of just understanding the human connection with other people. I'll leave it at that because there's a lot that could go into these conversations, and this just kind of gives like a barely the tip of the iceberg in terms of where I initially feel about it. And from there, though, there is the work that needs to be done to understand how do we look at Christianity outside of like the dominant system and the dominant system's animations attached to it, maybe like influencing it. And then how could there be, challenging it because it had become in the Judeo-Christian sense, become susceptible to influences of the dominant system coinciding with it, and then doing the work to peel back those layers and asking, and this is something that I work on as well, as like what could Christianity or Judeo-Christianity have done differently had the dominant system not built itself into it and became a force along with it and an influencing measure along with it. What does it look like outside of that? Is there really a substance of God at work beyond those measures? And it would really need a draw from those other portions if that does exist, which I tend to think it does, and then see how from there to connect with other people groups, because the inability to do that really is kind of a legacy of the dominant system having its influence over religion. And so once you start doing that work and then you start interpreting Christianity along those lines and in a different measure, then you can kind of be more situated to do some of these other projects and working with other cultures and beliefs, and then seeing spiritual connection and opportunity within those. And then also there is the sense though of like looking at what does it interpret is like the big picture. What's the vision here? What's this even for? What is it, where do we go from here in terms of making basically like the world a better place and connections with other people? And anyway, there's along those lines interpretive work to do. And anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now.